For our recording, I just repeat what we were doing in the very first minutes of our meeting today. We looked for exultant through different parts of the narrative in Mark 1:35, the beginning of Jesus' ministry, and later on he refers to this Eistodigar exultant in Mark 1:38. Another key passage, Mark 2:13, and Mark 4:3. Maybe this parable gives us a key to this exultant in Mark. The sower here as a reference to Jesus. Yes, Mark 6:1.
Can you share your screen with us?
Yes. Okay. One 35, 1:38, 2:13, Mark 4:3, within a parable of the sower as a key to, probably as a key to other passages. Mark 6:1, 8:27, and then our place. Mark 11:11, the verse from which we started our excursus in the potential meaning of exultant in Mark's Gospel, the kind of motif link. We spoke about the image of the way as very important for Mark's Gospel, at least until Jesus comes to the final point of his way to Jerusalem.
I see that I have like a half a page about this, and suggesting some of these symbolic meanings in my commentary.
Okay. Can you share with us now?
Well, you have my commentary in a file, don't you?
Yes.
Can you put up like volume 1, page 204?
William, page
200,
page 200.
204.
Here we are.
Can't see it. Okay. Oh. Yeah, so yeah, on the previous page I said literally in the context you would say it just means he's coming out from Capernaum, which is where he was. But then I say it's also part of an important group of sayings about the purpose of Jesus coming, and I cite these sayings, some of which use exalthen and some of which use other verbs.
Mm-hmm.
But they're all kind of generally about the purpose of Jesus' ministry. So a larger sense of coming. And then I say it's especially significant that he links his coming with preaching, and this makes him like Amos, who emerges from obscurity into the public to proclaim God's message, and to other later Jewish figures, such as Josephus, who portrays himself as a messenger who has come from God. And then I compare it to stuff in Greco-Roman texts, more than human figures, like Hermes is a herald, a kerux, sent to the gods from humanity. And I think the Daniel text is important. In Daniel 9, Gabriel uses exalthon for his coming forth from the heavenly world with a message. So that Mark is applying to Jesus the sort of language that was used of divine envoys. Oh, and Luke changes it to, "This is why I was sent out." So then I say it's possible that exalthon implies Jesus' pre-existence, but if so, the idea remains undeveloped elsewhere in Mark. So I open the door to that larger interpretation, but I don't think one could prove it.
Yes. Second, I'll show Luke 4:43, because this is indeed an important interpretation, a misunderstanding, whatever you would like. Do you see now Luke 4:43?
Yes. Da.
Yes. Ahoite jest tutaj apostalen.
Yeah, this is what one always wonders, right? Is Luke giving, well, he's giving his understanding of what Mark is saying. And is that maybe what Mark thought but didn't make explicit? Or is Luke taking it in a direction that Mark wouldn't have thought of? Is it a correct interpretation or a misinterpretation? But I'd say in this case, maybe it's a correct interpretation.
Yes. In any case, I think it was really important for us to dwell once again on this exaltation, the idea of moving for the way. Okay. Unless
One other thing I want to note in this verse, in verse 11, is just at the beginning, just this parallelism, eis elthen, eis Jerusalem, eis to hieron, just the parallelism of going into Jerusalem and into the temple. That, of course, the temple was the most important thing in Jerusalem, and the economic center not only of the city, but probably also the most powerful employer in the whole country. So it's just, that's reflected either deliberately or inadvertently in the way that he parallels into Jerusalem and into the temple.
Yes, once again we have this motive of going, of moving. Тогда Лариса, 12:14.
Epaureon, exultonton, auton, apobetanias, επέινασεν. Καί ειδούν σουκέν από μακρότεν έχουσαν φιούλα έλτεν η άρα τι εωρέσει εναωτέ. Καί ελτούν επαωτέν ουδέν εωρέν με φιούλα. Γόγαρ κάιρος ουκ εν σιούκον. Καί αποκριτέις είπεν αωτέ μεκέτι ειστον αιώνα εξού μεδέις καρπών φάγει. Καί έκουσιν βοηματετάι αутού.
Окей. На следующий день, когда они выходили из Вифании, Иисус почувствовал голод. Он издали увидел покрытую листьями смоковницу и пошел посмотреть, нет ли на ней плодов. Подошел, но плодов не увидел. Ну, давайте лучше даже сказать, плодов не нашел. Приблизился, чтобы не было такой по-русски игры слов. Одни листья. Еще не пришла пора смоков. Он сказал ей: так пусть вовек никто не вкусит твоих плодов. Ученики слышали это. Если нет никаких замечаний, то что мы будем делать с такого рода сэндвичами? Отложим обсуждение первой половинки сэндвича, пока не дойдем до второй половинки сэндвича. Since here we have a sandwich structure, what should we do? Should we just postpone our discussion of the two halves of the story till we come to the second part? What would be your recommendation, Joel?
Yeah, sure. Why don't we do that? Yeah. Because you can't really talk about the first part without the second part. So.
Okay. Then, unless we have any remarks on the with regard to the lower level of our analysis, the level of individual words and translations, we can move to the passage which is sandwiched between two parts of the story of the curse of the fig tree, and the story probably serves to explain Jesus coming to the temple. Any remarks on the very first level of this verse? If no, then let's move on to verses 15 through 17. Лариса, сегодня у вас много стихов выпадает читать.
Можно я спрошу одну вещь?
Можно, даже нужно.
Вот Гогар Кайрос Ук Эн Сюкон. Это действительно еще не было время смог, потому что, мне кажется, в точности здесь не сказано, что еще было рано для смог. А сказано просто не было время, было не время смог. Может быть, в этом смысле не упрощает смысл этого?
А как перевести тогда?
Ну, без еще.
Ну, видим, предполагается, что вот самое Кайрос Сюкон должно было наступить чуть позже. Вы имеете в виду, что русский перевод немного более эксплицитно указывает на временную динамику, что должна была наступить пора смог через некоторое время.
Да, но
А
было еще рано, а по-гречески неопределенно, и получается, а может быть, оно уже прошло наоборот.
Ну и как мы это по-русски можем выразить?
Это не было время смоков.
Это не было время смоков?
Ну, например.
Can you explain to me what the issue is of translation?
In Greek, we have hokar kairos uk and sukon,
Yeah.
which theoretically may be understood as either the time for the figs hasn't yet arrived, or that the time of figs was already over.
Oh,
So,
okay.
The reason why Hogar, Kairos, Uk, and Sukon is not indicated in the Greek text. Following the overall understanding that this happens in spring, and our extra-textual knowledge of the vegetation in our hemisphere, I render this еще не пришла пора смог, which means that the time for the figs hasn't yet come.
His clause about all he found was leaves. Right.
Yes.
Find any fruit.
Yes. In fact, I put if we translate this into English, I just put the small word "yet" in my translation. In fact, the same was done by the translators of the King James Version, but they put this "yet" in italics in order to indicate that this "yet" is not there.
Yeah, I would think most English translations would put in a "yet" there.
If we mean a symbolical meaning, then we must not put "yet."
So you're saying that if it's symbolic, maybe you shouldn't put the "yet" there. Yeah.
Yes, probably Larissa is right. In fact, we move into the discussion of how this parable, including its second part, how this parable relates to Jesus coming to the temple and so on. But if this is symbolic, then probably this "yet" would somehow imply that the things were going in the direction of the Jewish authorities recognizing Jesus in some future.
Yeah, which I don't think is what Mark wants to imply.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah. Yeah, of course. I mean, it just points out what a problematic text it is. You know, because Jesus comes there and, you know, he sees this fig tree, he wants some figs, but there's no figs ready. And it's because it's not the season for figs, and yet he curses the tree and it withers up. Which is, I think that points to it being a symbolic narrative. And when we talk about the other part, you know, we'll talk about how in Luke, this is a parable. It's just a straight parable in Luke chapter 13 about a fig tree that isn't bearing fruit, and then it's given a second chance. So, yeah, I guess maybe the second chance narrative in Luke might support what Larissa was saying. But I think that from the narrative itself, you get the impression that it's too early for, you know, for the fruit to be there because of the previous clause. And the other thing I'd say is the hogar kairos. You know, this is a typical Markan gar clause, and you know he puts these in a lot of different places, and they seem to be redactional. So I think where that clause is coming from is Mark is explaining, he's explaining the previous clause, you know, why it is that he didn't find, that he only found leaves there. And his explanation is because it wasn't yet the time for the figs. But no, it's interesting. And I bet somewhere in the history of interpretation, you're going to find somebody giving a more positive interpretation to this gar clause along the lines of what Larissa said, but I've never seen it.
Окей. Наверное, думаю, Лариса, вы правы, что тогда, когда у нас есть текст настолько нагруженный символическими деталями, наверное, не стоит вносить в него какие-то вещи, которые связаны не с символикой, а просто с нашим знанием ближневосточной флоры.
Ну,
What
теряющий,
is
как бы, да, торгумический момент.
what is the nominative singular of smokv? Just in Russian, the
Смоква.
smokva. It's a great word. I like it better than fig.
I don't know whether it's a loan word. Maybe it's definitely a loan word because in the original place of living of ancient Slavs, there were no fig trees.
Huh.
Okay. Smokva.
Smokva.
Let's go to the second part. Oh no, let's postpone the discussion, the second part, till we finish our discussion of Jesus in the temple. Лариса, 15 стих вам. Или, может быть, кого-то еще попросить? Кто может вас сменить? Александр Репкина, вы с нами? Хотите прочесть нам текст про Иисуса в храме? Александр, вас не слышим. Хорошо, тогда, Лариса, вы будете на сегодня нашей главной чтицей.
Из Иерусалима. Kai eselton eisto giron exato ekbalein tus poluntas kai tus agorazontas ento giro kai tas trapezeston kolubiston kai tas katedras ton polunton tas peristeras catestrapsen. Kai uk efien ginatis dienenke skeusdia tu viru. Дальше.
Ну, давайте еще стишок прочитаем, да.
Kai idasken kai elegen autois u gegraptai goti go oikosmu oikos proselches kletesetai pasintois etnesin humeisde pepoiekate auton spelejon leston.
Спасибо. Они пришли в Иерусалим. Иисус вошел в храм и стал выгонять всех там что-нибудь продавал или покупал. Он опрокинул столы менял, из камина, в которых сидели торговцы голубями. И ничего не позволял носить. Ну, может быть, если напишем по храму, по святилищу. Да? Он учил. В Писании сказано: дом мой, дом молитвы назовется для всех народов. А вы превратили его в логово разбойников, буквально в пещеру разбойников. Говорит, как вы думаете, в этой пещерной образности есть какой-то такой специальный символический смысл, что мы теряем его, когда заменяем пещеру на логово?
Возможно, потому что, наверное, грабители, как это, Али-Баба и 40 разбойников, вот, прятали что-то в пещеры. Но...
Хорошо. Да, я много лет назад этот текст набросал, и вот сейчас вижу, что, конечно, наверное, для того, чтобы сохранить возможные все символические обертона, лучше быть чуть-чуть ближе к греческому. Окей. Отец Реней, я вижу, что вы подняли руку.
Да, просто хотел поинтересоваться ваше мнение. Если у нас здесь употребляется слово «храм», и в греческом тексте мы не видим слова «двор», то есть буквально действительно не позволяло проносить по храму, то что могло стать в форлаге за этим иерон? Вряд ли ведь гейхаль.
Ну, тут у нас серьезный вопрос насчет того, был ли какой-то форлага у всех мест Марка.
Угу.
Вот. Несомненно, что какие-то речения зафиксированы Марка восходят к ипсиссимо верба Иисуса, какие-то восходят к ипсиссимо верба первых учеников, которые были еще сказаны по-арамейски. Но я не уверен, что все здесь, что вот эти стихи, что про них корректно задавать вопрос о том, что у них там было в их арамейском оригинале. Вопрос другой, который здесь встает, действительно, ничего не позволял носить по храму. Может быть, все-таки имеется в виду храм как комплекс зданий. Вот. И что это просто на том, как передать по-русски, потому что у нас все-таки храм – это одно здание. Да? Ну, скажем, если кто-то не будет ничего
Зависит
позволять
стандартно
носить
вполне.
по Сретенскому монастырю, что-что?
Я хотела сказать, что вообще в Новом Завете стандартно, что Иерон означает весь комплекс, то есть двор прежде всего, а наос означает внутреннюю часть.
Ну да. Но как нам это передать? Может, тогда действительно наос передавать как храм с большой буквы, а то Иерон просто как святилище?
Или наоборот. Мне
Или
кажется,
наоборот?
по-русски скорее наоборот вообще-то.
Да, по-русски
В смысле,
наоборот.
ну да, но с другой стороны, вот действительно в 16 стихе только что было «Ничего не позволял носить по двору храма, у меня я это дело убрал». Вот, исходя из как раз того, что говорил еще с Машей. Но есть у нас по-русски какое-то слово, которое могло бы означать и храм, и весь храмовый комплекс?
В том-то и дело, что, получается, мы употребляем словосочетание «храмовый комплекс». Потому что сейчас, если мы оставляем слово «храм», сразу очень мощный ассоциативный ряд через призму современных храмов включается. И человек
Да,
подразумевает,
именно с тем, что это один храм, то есть наус.
да.
И
Ну, и
само
если,
слово храм означает дом, прежде всего.
Простите?
Само слово храм – это же дом, собственно говоря. Русское слово.
храмина, да,
Хором.
храмина.
Так
Ну
что
да,
ассоциации со двором, конечно, не возникают. Но святилище тут вряд ли поможет. Введение слова святилище. То какие-то ассоциации могут возникнуть с чем-то языческим.
ну или с алтарем. Тогда уж.
Или с
Слушайте,
алтарем, но в каких-то контекстах определенных, вот если будет.
ну да. Но, ну и
Скажем,
что же мы
послание к
можем
евреям.
сделать? Что же мы здесь можем поставить?
Храм, а в словарике, что храм обозначает всю территорию. И дворы, и святилище, и святое святых.
То есть поставить сноску типа примечания и указать. В данном случае подразумевается вся храм. Так?
Ну, наверное, да. Потому что ведь и в 15 стихе у нас тоже Иисус вошел в храм. Это имеется в виду в храмовый комплекс. Вряд ли он, как Богородица в православном предании о введении во храм, прямо вошел в святую святых и стал тут всех выгонять. То есть у нас не только в 16 стихе, но и в 15 стихе под храмом имеется в виду весь храмовый комплекс. Слава,
Я подумал, простите, что
вы
вот
что хотите сказать?
храмовая гора все-таки вот более, как ни странно, это и отстраненно по отношению к храму звучит, но это некая территория, площадка. Храмовая гора, вот что-то вот такое нельзя здесь использовать?
И ничего не позволял носить по храмовой горе? Нет,
Ну, это, конечно, смешно, но вот, в принципе, вот если как бы описать это как территорию, то это тогда так.
ну да, но может быть действительно это лучше отнести в сноски, потому что можно, конечно, сказать, что Иисус вошел на храм, Иисус вошел на территорию храма и стал выгонять оттуда всех, кто что-нибудь продавал, и ничего не позволял носить по храмовой территории. но как-то это не будет стилистически не соответствовать тому, чего мы бы ожидали от древнего нарратива. Вот это скорее из какого-то описания инженерного.
Да и богословски. Все-таки он очищает храм именно, вот, а не просто храмовую территорию. Это тоже существенно, что говорится
Да,
именно
что
о
ж, тогда
храме.
пишем, и ничего не позволял носить по храму.
Можно в каких-то местах слово «двор» использовать,
Каких-то,
наверное.
может быть, но вряд ли вот в истории про очищение храма.
Да, наверное, не здесь. Да.
Ну да. Окей.
So you're talking about the translation of temple here on as Kram?
Yes. Because in Russian, the term храм, first of all,
Church.
yes, refers to the church building to the inside.
Yeah.
Though here, obviously, not the more sacred building of the temple complex, but the complex itself, including all of the buildings and courtyards, is being meant. But we decided that this should probably be put in the footnote, while the translation should still keep to more uniform translation of to Hieron as храм.
Yeah. Well, and it's hard to figure out, what Mark thinks sort of the geography of the temple is, and where these people are selling. And there's a lot of speculation in the secondary literature about, are they outside of the temple courts proper? So that would go along with that. But so my question is about the translation of another word, though. In maybe we want to do this later. In verse 17, Razboynikov. So what are Razboynikov? Are they just like robbers, or are they?
Robert.
Yes. Let's try.
Because because the Greek word leistes, is really more like a brigand or a bandit, like a highwayman, who, and it's the same word that Josephus uses. It's his typical word for the revolutionaries that he's against in the war against the Romans.
Yes, but this is the same connotations that Russian разбойники have.
Because I noticed that I
Разбойники с
was looking
большой
up,
дороги.
yeah, because I noticed that some translations, I was looking at Russian. So, I'm the English word brigand. I was seeing how that is translated into Russian, and sometimes it's разбойник, but sometimes it's bandit.
In fact, разбойники и бандиты, that's almost synonyms in Russian, but разбойники is a bit older. Bandit is still and so there's more referring more to the contemporary reality or to Chicago of the days of the
The
Sicilian
1920s.
mafia. Yes.
Yeah,
Yes,
I'm from Chicago, by the way, so I know all
okay.
about this image of Chicago. Yeah, but so if you're walking down the street in Moscow and somebody comes up and with a knife or a gun and says, "Give me all your money," is that a razboinik? Or,
Mm,
I mean, is it just a robber, or does it have some more?
I
I think
think
the Greek, because in Greek you have kleptes, that's a robber,
yes. I think in Russian imagery and it concerns semantic field of разбойник in Russian. Разбойники usually do their bad deeds in companies.
Oh, okay.
So this probably closer to the meaning of Lestes in Josephus.
Yeah. Okay, good. Yeah. It's okay then. Yeah.
Yes, and then on the next level, you come to the main question, to the set of questions. First of all, where do all these people see it in reality? As concerns the Jerusalem temple or the first decades of our era, and then how can temple function if they stop buying and selling, and how in this context can an ordinary Jew understand Jesus' behavior?
Well, yeah, and this is, it's central to Ed Sanders'
Yes.
reconstruction of the historical Jesus and, why he got in trouble. And because he says, and this has been very influential, as you know, that this sort of buying and selling, and especially money changing, was necessary because people were coming from all over the place with different currencies, even from abroad, and you would have to have somebody there to change the money. And people are coming from, far away elsewhere in Palestine, and they're not going to schlep their sacrificial animals with them, so they have to buy in Jerusalem itself. And so his interpretation, because the old interpretation, the standard interpretation, is that you shouldn't have buying and selling in the temple, and that it's an abuse to have this sort of setup. But Sanders says, no, it's necessary to have these people buying and selling. And what Jesus was really trying to do was to symbolically prophesy the destruction of the temple. And that's what he does by turning over the tables. So, I'm not sure that that's totally convincing, but it's been a very influential interpretation of this action on the level of the historical Jesus. And Sanders would say, that probably the interpretation of the action that's given in verses 16, well, or at least in verse 17, that's later than the level of the historical Jesus himself. And you notice that, John has a parallel to this, and he has Jesus use an entirely different Old Testament text. So he says you can't go on the basis of the Old Testament texts that are employed because they're later, and you have to just go on the basis of the action itself and what it's supposed to signify.
And what is the motivation for this in John?
Well, I think John also thinks, you know, in John he says, "Don't take my father's house and make it a house of merchandise." So there, I think, you know, the ascribed motivation is that there is economic activity going on in the temple, and you shouldn't have economic activity going on in the temple. But one other thing that's, I think, relevant is this, in verse 16, he doesn't allow them to bring anything through the temple. And this, it may relate to prophecies in like Zechariah, where there will no longer be a traitor in the house of the Lord in that day. It's an eschatological prophecy in Zechariah 9 or something like that. So there
Let's
may
look.
be, you know, there's both Old Testament texts that are explicitly invoked here, but also ones that may be implicit.
Zechariah 9.
Let's see. Yeah, I think it's in Zechariah 9. Hold on. Let's see what that's verse. Zechariah, okay, Zechariah 14, verse 21. I knew it was somewhere from Zechariah 9 to 14, because that's kind of Trito or
Mhm.
Deutero Zechariah or something.
Yes. Okay. And what is the link between Zechariah 14:21 and our place?
Well, I don't know that so it's an eschatological prophecy on that day. There won't any, let's see, I say in my commentary, in the present connection, it probably like the thing about he didn't allow anyone to carry a container, a skeos, through the temple. And I say that probably refers to a container for transporting animal blood and other sacrificial elements. If so, there may be an allusion to the Zechariah passage that speaks of the exclusion from the temple of the merchants who supplied richly pure containers for sacrifices, because they will no longer be necessary because all the pots in Jerusalem will be holy. Huh. I don't know if that makes much sense, but that's what I said. Anyway, it does seem to me that that the Zechariah 14:21 is relevant.
Quite often, modern commentators think that the word Knani
Yeah.
in the Hebrew Bible has the meaning of seller, or the person who goes from town to town selling something
Do you
I
have the
think-
text there? Are you on your Bible Works? Because we're still back at your translation.
Yes, I checked the Greek translation of the Knani,
Yeah.
and I do not see that this understanding was characteristic for the translator of the Septuagint, at least. But let's.
Well, and I want to see the background of this in, the Jewish war, where the Leistai, the bandits, they invaded the temple and they set up their center of operations in the temple, and that would comport with the Kanaani, isn't that's the same word that becomes zealots, right? Or at least it has some of the same consonants. So I think somewhere I suggest that Mark or some predecessor understood the Kanaani as zealots, and he took it as a reference to the zealots, the Leistai, setting up in the temple.
Mhm. It's an interesting exegesis. I think at least if you look not at the Greek text itself, it's another question, but at the interpretation of the Greek text and its Hebrew background in modern Bible studies, then I think it might have been interesting for us to look at how the word Haknani is translated in modern translations. For example, Job, chapter 40, verse 30, which is sometimes the verse numeration here is different, but it's interesting that here the question is about whether the Knaanim are able to divide the dead Leviathan.
Oh yeah.
Probably in order to sell the meat of Leviathan. As concerns the Septuagint, we have Phoenikon Gene as translation of Aknanim, but in modern translations we have, for example, in King James Version, shall they found him among the merchants.
Yeah.
The New International Version, will they divide it up among the merchants? New Jerusalem Bible, and then retailed by, is he Leviathan to be sold by the fishing guild and then retailed by merchants? The same translation is NRSV. So if Mark or his sources had understood the word Knani in Hebrew Bible, at least sometimes in the same way as the authors of modern English language versions of the Hebrew Bible
Mhm.
do, then probably he might have Mark or his sources, they might have seen the same meaning in Zechariah.
Mhm. Yeah.
But
And I think that, yeah, I think the interpretation I was suggesting, I mean, it's pretty far-fetched because I'm pretty sure the word for zealot is with a kof, not a kaf, and with an aleph, not an ayin. But
yes,
those things were kind of close to each other in the first
I think
century.
for Semitic languages, these are two different words, and probably, even though we have some indication that different guttural sounds began to be confounded by the turn of the era, but probably not to the same degree as would be necessary for this. But you see that even in some modern translations of the Zechariah passage, we read, and there shall no longer be traders in the house of the Lord. In NRSV, NJB, so
Yeah, and this, this section of Zechariah is important in this section of the gospel because you've just had Jesus coming into Jerusalem on the donkey, and that's from Zechariah 9.
yes. Oh, here's the ultimate source.
Yeah, Mercator.
So at least not only in modern translations, but already in the Vulgate, Knani here is understood as Mercator. If this goes back to the understanding of the Knani in the Jewish milieu by the time of Saint Jerome, maybe the same understanding of Zechariah was current even some centuries before this, in the days of early Christianity. Маша, что вы скажете?
Я не знаю, я не встречала. Но надо посмотреть.
У нас же 12 малых пророков были изданы этим самым, господи, в нашей Геттингенской серии вместе с Хойт Рейс. У вас нет под рукой Геттингенской серии? Было бы интересно посмотреть.
Я посмотрю. Да.
Нет ли
Интересно,
такого перевода у какого-нибудь какой-нибудь из наших рецензий?
Да, можно посмотреть еще просто комментарий Иеронима. Он обычно, мне кажется, в таких случаях может ссылаться. Я поищу. Просто это не очень быстро.
Хорошо.
Earlier in this chapter in Zechariah in 14, you have, you know, the Lord will come forth, you have these visions of eschatological war, and it's going to happen on the Mount of Olives in Jerusalem. And you have, this vision of the Mount of Olives splitting. Which I think probably influences Matthew's thing about the earthquake, at the end of the gospel when Jesus is crucified. So I think this passage was being mined, both by later Jews and also by Christians as an eschatological prophecy. So I don't know. I think that's probably significant. Yeah, but it may be that. So you're thinking that the Vulgate is the first clear instance in which Kanaani is interpreted as a merchant.
At least the earliest witness from those witnesses that I have on my screen.
Yeah.
This does not mean that we do not have any other witnesses, and Masha is going to look in Aquila, Symmachus, and Theodotion.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, this is indeed a very interesting question, whether this last verse of the book of Zechariah looms somewhere in the background here, but still, what was, if we think that this has something to do with historical Jesus, as Alexandra thinks, this was
Yeah. So yeah. Well, so just to continue, with Sanders' thought process, and I'm not sure if he's right. So he would connect this act, and he thinks that the things that Jesus did are a more reliable indicator of what he was about than the words that are ascribed to him. But so he thinks that he would connect this action in the temple with an intent to pronounce judgment on the temple and to prophesy the temple's destruction. So then he connects this action with Jesus saying about the temple that's reported in Mark at his trial, where false witnesses say that he said that he would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, which also comes up at the beginning of the eschatological chapter, where he says, that there won't be a stone left on a stone. So he thinks that this action was meant to indicate the coming destruction of the temple, and that's why Jesus got in so much trouble. And he also connects it with Josephus's account of this guy who went all over Jerusalem in the years before the city was destroyed, saying, you know, a voice from the east, a voice from the west, and prophesying the destruction of the temple until the Romans came and laid siege, and the first catapult stone, I think, that they threw over killed him. Um, so so he uses that to argue that, you know, there were people, other people who were predicting the destruction of the temple, and that they were considered to be troublemakers. Though in this guy's case, they don't incarcerate him or anything because they figure that he's crazy, and the authorities just interview him and release him. So, but you know, a lot of his polemic, Sanders's polemic, is against Christian interpreters, especially, who want to say that the temple was corrupt, and one of the signs of its corruption was that there were these money changers and other merchants in the temple precincts. And he thinks that's, you know, part of kind of an anti-Jewish interpretation of what was going on in the temple. And others have pushed back at him. For example, Craig Evans, who wants to salvage the historicity of, well, he wants to say that Jesus' action was an attempted reform, not a prophesied destruction. So I'd say that's like the main debate that has been going on for the last 30 or 40 years amongst those who are trying to interpret the action of the historical Jesus. Was it an attempt to reform the temple and to cleanse it, or was it a prophecy of the temple's destruction? Which the temple's destruction, which this saying, you know, Jesus' logion about the temple does make Jesus the agent of the temple's destruction. I will destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up again. And I think Sanders wants to say that the first part goes back to Jesus, I will destroy the temple, and the second part he's not so sure about.
But promise to destroy the temple already puts Jesus outside of the mainstream Judaism at the time. The main idea of Sanders was somehow to put Jesus back into the Judean matrix and to claim that, in fact, there was no significant difference between early Jesus movement and Judaism. But whether the destruction of the temple takes place as a fulfillment of Zechariah's prophecy, or as a sign of the corruption of the temple hierarchy, or just because the sacrifices themselves are not pleasant to the God. In any case, this is
Yeah, I mean, you know, I think this is a really tough problem. I mean, I do think that Sanders is more careful about this than what you just said. And what you just said reminds me more of Paula Fredrickson, who I think takes Sanders and goes one step further, and she wants to secure, you know, put Jesus more just totally within mainstream Judaism than Sanders does, because Sanders also he quotes Klausner, who I'm going to be talking about in my lectures next week. Klausner said, "Ex nihilo nihil fit." Nothing comes out of nothing. And so that was Klausner's way of saying, well, yes, Jesus belongs within first century Judaism, and yet, you know, the churches seeing him as standing outside of Judaism, that comes out of something. Where there's smoke, there's fire. But Sanders, you know, so he is trying to situate Jesus within first century Judaism, but that's why he goes to like this guy that Josephus refers to, you know, who was prophesying the destruction of Jerusalem. And he also has some passages, a passage or two from First Enoch that he thinks refers to the destruction of the temple and not its rebuilding. Though I think he's been questioned on that. So yeah, I mean, I really think this is very difficult, and that's why I didn't really do that much on the historical Jesus, because how can you get back, you know, to what he had in mind when, like, the gospel witnesses themselves give different justifications, you know, John versus the synoptics. And so if you eliminate those, then all you're left with the action is the action itself, and the action could have a lot of different meanings. So I don't know. I think it's really difficult. But I guess the one thing I would want to say is that, you know, he probably viewed it in some sort of eschatological context. And, you know, and there were expectations that the Messiah, when he comes, will do something in the temple. The Messiah is somehow connected with the temple. Though the connection of Jesus with the temple in the gospel tradition seems to be basically negative. But it's a connection with the temple still.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that it is right that this Jerome's interpretation goes back to Septuagint revisions, at least to Aquila, who translates Hanani as metabolos, so it's trader.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so yeah, probably this is the earliest source of this interpretation.
Huh. And do some people want to say that Aquila was a Jewish Christian?
We don't know for sure.
Or is it Symmachus? Or okay.
Yeah, it's more about Symmachus,
Okay.
not about Aquila.
Okay.
No, it seems that the early church fathers confound all of them. So there are also some stories about Aquila being for some time Christian, but then lapsing back from Christianity.
Uh-huh.
I do not think these biographies can be trusted, but in any case, Aquila's text is a witness that more or less about the same time when the first Gospels appeared, this prophecy of Zechariah might have been read and understood as a prophecy that in the eschaton there will be no more sellers, traders, and merchants in the temple.
Yeah. So that would relate, yeah, that might relate to the passage in Mark about the skeuos.
Yes. In this case, it's not the Septuagint, but some alternative translation that is behind the Gospel of Mark.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'd like to see
Okay.
that.
Okay.
I'd like to see that translation in the source.
Yeah. Yeah, because I think that everywhere where Mark quotes, almost everywhere where Mark quotes the Old Testament, he quotes according to the Septuagint as we know it now. But
Yeah, not always, not always. Yeah. But usually,
usually, yes.
yeah. I mean, sometimes he seems to have access
Okay.
either to Semitic original or to translations which are closer to the Masoretic text.
Yes, it's a very interesting topic.
Yeah.
Okay, it's high time for us to make a pause here for 2 weeks. And we are inside the sandwich created by Mark. So we'll return to the meaning of the fig tree in 2 weeks' time.
Good.
Спасибо всем, кто был с нами.
Спасибо, всего
Сегодня.
доброго.
Спасибо.
Спасибо.
До
До
свидания.
свидания.
До свидания.
Спасибо, до свидания.